Donald Trump has just issued a serious export warning directed at Canada. It was not a routine tariff tweak, not a quiet negotiating signal, but a clear and specific threat to restrict American exports that Canada relies on heavily. These include agricultural technology, semiconductor components, and specialized manufacturing equipment, all referenced in a formal economic directive from the White House. Sources inside 3 different federal agencies described the order to Reuters as the most aggressive one-sided trade tool this administration has used since taking office. The directive gave Ottawa 96 hours to withdraw every pending USMCA dispute panel challenge, suspend its retaliatory tariff plan, and return to bilateral talks on terms set by Washington, or face export limits so extensive that Canadian industrial production would start feeling the impact within 30 days. Mark Carney did not call an emergency cabinet meeting. He did not request a new diplomatic back channel. Instead, he walked to a podium and delivered a surprise announcement so unexpected, so strategically calculated, and so immediately consequential that a senior White House trade advisor later told Politico privately that nobody inside the building saw it coming. What is unfolding now goes far beyond a simple trade clash between neighboring governments. It is a test of whether the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in modern history can survive an executive branch that has decided economic pressure is a strategy, and whether a G7 prime minister with a central banker's understanding of leverage points can consistently outmaneuver threats designed for opponents who supposedly have no alternatives. Canada, however, does have alternatives. Carney just used one Washington never placed on its list. So what exactly triggered this confrontation? On April 1st, 2026, the Trump White House released what it formally called the American Export Sovereignty Directive. According to officials familiar with the preparation process, the document had been under development within the Commerce Department and the Office of the United States Trade Representative since mid-March. Work accelerated after Canada's USMCA auto tariff complaint was accepted for expedited dispute panel review. The directive invoked Section 1753 of the Export Control Reform Act, giving the president authority to restrict exports of goods considered essential to American national economic security if a trading partner takes actions deemed contrary to U.S. interests. The products listed in the directive were carefully chosen. Agricultural biotechnology inputs, including seed treatments and crop protection chemicals produced by American companies and widely used by Canadian prairie farmers, appeared first. Semiconductor fabrication components essential for Canadian technology manufacturing appeared next. Advanced CNC machining equipment critical to Canadian aerospace and auto parts production followed. Each category was selected with remarkable precision to maximize pressure on Canadian industries considered politically sensitive to Carney's governing coalition. Officials within Global Affairs Canada described the targeting as deliberate, sophisticated, and clearly the work of analysts who had studied Canada's economy closely. This was not just political theater. Canada's agricultural sector, the wheat, canola, and pulse crop producers across Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, depends on crop inputs manufactured in the United States that are not easily replaced at commercial scale by suppliers elsewhere. The directive was designed to exploit that dependency quickly. But when a prime minister responds to that kind of targeted economic pressure with a surprise announcement that catches the White House off guard, it usually means the preparation behind that response has been running far longer than observers realized. The escalation had been building since late March 2026, when Canada publicly rejected Trump's earlier tweet-based trade threats. During a televised interview, Carney told international media that a tweet is not a law, while 3 G7 finance ministers reportedly called Ottawa to express support. Inside the administration, officials began reconsidering their approach. The informal social media tactic had failed. The formal directive became the new strategy, a legally grounded instrument citing statutory authority, including a clear deadline and specific demands. However, there was a complication the administration had not fully anticipated. According to reporting from the Financial Times and the Globe and Mail, Canada's trade response team had been quietly preparing for American export restriction scenarios since January 2026. These preparations were not vague or theoretical. Internal contingency planning documents described by multiple sources included a detailed section on potential American export control escalation. Analysts identified the sectors most likely to be targeted, modeled possible economic impacts, and outlined a counter strategy based on one simple principle. When Washington restricts exports, Ottawa immediately announces alternative suppliers that already exist. In other words, they were not scrambling after the threat. They were waiting for it. At 11:22 a.m. on April 1st, the White House directive became public. At 11:47 a.m., just 25 minutes later, Carney's office informed the Parliamentary Press Gallery that the Prime Minister would make an announcement at noon. Not a reaction, an announcement. The wording was intentional. Canada was not responding to Trump. Canada was presenting a decision already made. At noon, Carney stepped to the podium at Rideau Cottage. His expression carried the calm composure that experienced observers associate with statements capable of moving financial markets. For the first 90 seconds, he did not even mention the American directive. Instead, he began with a declaration. Canada had concluded a major agricultural technology partnership with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Effective immediately, Canadian farmers would gain guaranteed access to European crop inputs, British agricultural biotechnology, Australian seed treatment technology, and New Zealand precision agriculture systems, many at terms more favorable than existing American supply arrangements. He then revealed the crucial detail. The agreement had been finalized on March 28th after negotiations that began February 4th. It covered 94% of the agricultural input categories referenced in the U.S. export directive. Carney paused briefly before delivering the line that defined the moment. Canada had noted the directive. Canada had already addressed it. Financial markets reacted instantly. Stocks of American agricultural biotechnology firms, companies whose Canadian export revenue had been the leverage mechanism behind the White House directive, fell between 2.8 and 4.1% within 30 minutes. The reason was obvious. Export restrictions only create leverage if the target lacks alternative suppliers. Carney had just publicly confirmed that Canada already had alternatives covering nearly the entire category before the directive was issued. The leverage disappeared before it could even be used. Commodity traders in Chicago interpreted the announcement as reassurance about Canadian crop production stability. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the US dollar within an hour. In Brussels, a European Commission trade spokesperson confirmed the existence and March 28th activation date of the partnership agreement, demonstrating that the announcement was not improvised. It had been coordinated internationally and timed carefully. The historical context is revealing. In 1971, when President Richard Nixon imposed a sudden surcharge on imports, many American allies, including Canada, were caught off guard and forced to negotiate from a weak position. Ottawa had few alternatives and little preparation. Carney's approach appears designed to ensure that Canada never faces such a situation again. His government spent months quietly building alternative supply networks, allied partnerships, and legal strategies before the confrontation reached its current intensity. A similar lesson came from 2018 when tariffs on steel and aluminum led to a cautious Canadian response that some in Washington interpreted as weakness. Carney has repeatedly suggested that restraint alone can encourage additional pressure. The April 1st announcement was therefore not merely defensive. It was the strategic outcome of lessons learned from earlier disputes. Diplomatic analysts quickly recognized the significance. Former Canadian diplomat Colin Robertson told CTV News that the Agricultural Technology Partnership represents the culmination of a broader supply chain independence strategy executed quietly for months. Once new supply relationships become operational, he explained, the leverage American exporters once held in bilateral negotiations simply disappears. Trump responded later that afternoon with a social media post dismissing the partnership as a fake arrangement that would collapse within weeks. He also threatened to expand the export directive to include pharmaceutical ingredients and medical technology. Shortly afterward, the White House press office confirmed that such measures were under active consideration. Legal scholars immediately noted complications with that escalation. Restricting pharmaceutical and medical technology exports to a NATO ally could conflict with humanitarian trade exemptions embedded within USMCA and World Trade Organization rules. Experts warned that such a move might trigger challenges not only from Canada, but also from American pharmaceutical companies, medical device manufacturers, and hospital systems whose supply chains are deeply integrated across the border. That possibility creates a dilemma. Following through could produce legal battles and domestic economic consequences. Failing to follow through would reinforce Canada's emerging strategy: wait for the legal limits of American threats to appear. Analysts argue that Carney's announcement removed the fundamental assumption behind many U.S. pressure tactics, that Canada lacks alternatives. Once alternatives exist, export restrictions lose much of their negotiating power. Even within American business circles, the reaction was mixed. The American Farm Bureau warned that restricting agricultural technology exports could accelerate Canada's push toward supply independence, ultimately harming U.S. exporters in the long term. Three strategic miscalculations became visible. First, the leverage miscalculation. The directive assumed Canada had no viable alternatives. Second, the timing miscalculation. The directive was issued after those alternatives had already been finalized. Third, the escalation miscalculation. Expanding into pharmaceutical trade would open legal challenges under international agreements and domestic regulations. Beyond the immediate dispute lies a broader question about American trade strategy. For decades, Washington assumed that allied economies were too dependent on U.S. exports and technology to risk developing alternatives. But as this confrontation shows, partners may quietly prepare those alternatives long before pressure is applied. Canada's approach, building alliances, diversifying supply chains, and preparing legal frameworks may become a model studied by other U.S. allies. As of now, Canada's agricultural technology partnership with Europe, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand is operational and covers most of the export categories targeted by the White House directive. American firms connected to those exports have seen stock declines, while the Canadian dollar has strengthened slightly. Debate continues in Washington about whether further escalation is legally and politically viable. The USMCA dispute panel that originally triggered the directive continues independently of these developments. Meanwhile, policymakers, analysts, and businesses on both sides of the border are watching closely for the next move. In simple terms, the sequence is striking. A major export threat was issued to force Canada into compliance. 25 minutes later, Canada revealed that the dependency behind that threat had already been largely eliminated through international partnerships finalized days earlier. The leverage arrived after the leverage had already been removed. What remains is a strategic confrontation between two very different approaches, one relying on economic coercion against dependent partners, and another built on ensuring dependency no longer exists when the pressure comes. The results of that clash are now visible not only in political statements, but also in financial markets, legal analysis, and the rapidly changing network of alliances shaping global trade.